English translation and 588th contact Wednesday, the 4th of June 2014, 14:07 hours.
Hello, Ptah, dear friend. Florina told me that you were coming at 14 o'clock hours today, but I thought you were coming for the correction work. I am sorry I am 7 minutes late, because I was still in Schmidruti and also had a short visit to welcome.
Greetings also, Edward, dear friend. I was short of time, so no need to apologize. But there is probably a misunderstanding, because today I am here to discuss with you some things that are important, also concerning the Internet excerpts concerning the death penalty, which was introduced by the EU dictatorship in an underhanded way, without the populations of the individual EU states and other states having any knowledge of it. I have read in detail the Internet excerpts which you asked Florina to send to me. And as for the correction work, you and Bernadette will be able to do it tomorrow, but Njana will be in charge of it, as usual at 1330 HRS.
We already spoke on the 5th of April because of the lousy EU dealings, that the EU dictatorship has secret plans to use military force against the EU population in the event of riots, which means that the military also accepts or orders the killing of demonstrators, etc. That, at any rate, is what you said to me when I mentioned a forecast of the future situation in Europe. Our conversation was as follows.
Excerpt from the 584th Official Contact Conversation from the 5th of April, 2014.
That's just what I think it is going to be. But I have another question now, because I read something, namely a forecast of the future situation that threatens Europe and the European Union in the next few years, and that things will get out of hand. We have not been talking openly about political matters for a long time now, but this is the dictatorship of the EU, and I would like to know personally, also in the interests of the people who ask me, what is the situation as regards the human beings finally standing up against this crazy dictatorship?
It is undeniable that social unrest has been going on for some time in various EU countries, and this is already a precursor to further and ever-increasing unrest, which in the coming years threatens to become more and more widespread in many EU countries, even to the point of civil war-like conditions. And since the common sense of the majority of the Swiss people has spoken a clear word and triumphed over the mass immigration initiative, many citizens of EU countries have been startled out of their lethargy and EU bondage and have realized how unfree they really are under the EU dictatorship. As a result, more and more resistance is now beginning to stir up from the peoples of the EU. Although according to our calculations, the risk of preparatory riots and civil war-like forms is already 27% for some EU peoples. It is a fact that not only in the EU dictatorship and in all the supposedly democratic states belonging to it, but also worldwide in non-EU states, secret plans exist which amount to the fact that when the already threatening riots break out, it is no longer the police who are supposed to maintain order, but that everything is to be effectively put down with evil military force, as is also the case in many places worldwide in non-EU states. Yes, that was our part of the discussion.
But you did not say exactly that the EU dictatorship had already deceitfully reintroduced the death penalty in 2009 without the majority of the EU population, and also the Swiss population having learned anything about it. What I did understand, however, was that anything can be carried out by force of arms through military intervention, which is then also inevitably connected with the killing of human beings. But that the EU dictatorship has reintroduced the death penalty for incidents such as riots, demonstrations and unrest, etc., and has retained it in its criminal constitution. I only found out last weekend in a conversation with Patrick, so I asked him to copy something from the internet so that I could send it to you via Florina so that you could look through it. I have also found the following on the internet myself.
NWO Academy, EU, Justice, Totalitarianism, EU Constitution allows for death penalty, and killing the 28th of December, 2013 EU Constitution allows the death penalty, and killing for rebellion, or uprising.
The Charter of Fundamental Rights. Contrary to the abolition of the death penalty as required by the principle of human dignity, Article 102 of the Basic Law allows for the reintroduction of the death penalty in the event of war or imminent threat of war, but also for the killing of persons to quell an insurrection or revolt. It is not the full-fledged Article 262, Paragraph 2 of the Constitutional Treaty, which prohibits capital punishment and execution, but the declaration on this article, which stems from the 1950 Convention on Human Rights. The Union's powers in the field of the common foreign and security policy are sufficient to introduce the death penalty in the interest of the effectiveness of missions or even defense. Rioting or insurrection can also be seen in certain demonstrations. The use of deadly firearms in such situations is not a violation of the right to life under the EU Constitutional Treaty. Quoted verbatim from Arguments Against the Approval of the Treaty Establishing a Constitution for Europe by Dr. Jur. Karl Albrecht Schachtschneider, professor of public law at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. Further distribution of the document is expressly desired. The exact wording of the text of the treaty concerning the death penalty and killing in the event of riot or insurrection, as well as the explanation of this, can be found on pages 433, 434 of the official edition of the EU Constitution, published by the EU authorities themselves. In practice, this means that, for example, during the demonstrations in Leipzig and other cities in the late 1980s, which led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the GDR and the collapse of communism, real socialism, as a whole, the police would have had the contractual right to shoot, kill, or later execute demonstrators. In the Hungarian freedom fight in 1956, which was in vain, this was indeed the way the Soviet regime of the time did it. If the EU Constitution came into force, the executive would have the same rights in all EU states as the Soviet Soldateska in the former Eastern Bloc. Austria can only regain its neutrality by leaving the EU. In her review of the EU summit in Berlin in June, German Chancellor Merkel's CDU declared, among other things, that she was satisfied. In future, the EU would speak with one voice in foreign policy. The EU will get a foreign minister for currently 27 member states, by whose grace and under whatever disguise, envoy or similar. In any case, this means the end of any independent foreign policy, and thus also of Austria's neutrality. This is probably the reason why it was decided months ago to change the official name of the former Austrian Foreign Ministry to Ministry for International Relations. Did you notice that for many years elaborate working groups at the highest level negotiated a reform, also, such a constantly strained camouflage word for destruction, of the Austrian federal constitution behind closed doors? When it became clear that the EU constitution could not enter into force as planned 2 years ago due to the results of the votes in France and the Netherlands, the Austrian reform package was also put on ice. Now, after the successful Berlin EU Constitutional Summit, the reform of the Austrian constitution is on the move again. It still contains the federal constitutional law from 26.10, 1955 bank holiday on Austria's permanent neutrality. Something as obsolete as Mozartkugeln and Lipizzaner has to be reformed, right? That is what former Chancellor Schussel explained to us inexperienced citizens years ago. But it will be exactly those inexperienced citizens or their sons and grandchildren who should risk their lives for the reformation of neutrality. According to the official program of the incumbent SPO-OVP coalition government, the deployment of Austrian soldiers abroad should be obligatory in the future instead of only on a voluntary basis. For my part, I find the whole thing to be a farce and hypocrisy unparalleled in the EU, with blatant contradictions to the explanations given in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. as evidenced by the following internet excerpts.
Explanatory notes on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, 2007, C30302.
The following explanations were originally drawn up under the responsibility of the Presidium of the Convention that drafted the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. They have been updated under the responsibility of the Presidium of the European Convention in the light of the adaptations made by the Convention to the text of the Charter, in particular, Articles 51 and 52, and the evolution of Union law. These explanations have no legal status as such, but are a useful aid to interpretation and help clarify the provisions of the Charter.
Title I: Human Dignity.
Explanation on Article 1. Human Dignity. Human dignity is not only a fundamental right in itself, but is the very foundation of fundamental rights. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights enshrines human dignity in its preamble. Since recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. In its judgment from the 9th of October 2001, in Case C 377-98, Netherlands Vos, European Parliament and Council, 2001 ECR 7079, paragraphs 70 to 77, the Court of Justice confirmed that the fundamental right to human dignity is part of Union law. It follows in particular that none of the rights set out in this charter may be used to violate the dignity of another human being, and that human dignity is part of the very essence of the rights set out in this charter. It must therefore remain unaffected even when a right is restricted. Explanation on Article 2, Right to Life. Paragraph 1 of this article is based on the first sentence of Article 2. Paragraph 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR, which reads as follows. 1. The right to life of every human being shall be protected by law. The second sentence of that provision, which concerned the death penalty, has become obsolete following the entry into force of Protocol No. 6 to the ECHR, Article 1 of which reads as follows: the death penalty is abolished. No one shall be condemned to that penalty or executed. Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the Charter is based on this provision. The provisions of Article 2 of the Charter correspond to the provisions of the said articles of the ECHR and of the additional protocol. In accordance with Article 52, Paragraph 3 of the Charter, they have the same meaning and scope. Thus, the negative definitions contained in the ECHR must also be considered as part of the Charter. Article 2, Paragraph 2, ECHR. A killing shall not be regarded as a violation of this article if it is caused by the use of force strictly, necessary to A. defend someone against unlawful violence, B. lawfully arrest someone or prevent someone who is lawfully deprived of their liberty from escaping. 14.12. 2007 in Official Journal of the European Union. C300-317. Editor's note: references to the article numbering of the treaties have been updated and some errors have been corrected. C. Put down a riot or insurrection lawfully. BB, Article 2 of Protocol No. 6 to the ECHR. A state may make provision in its law for the death penalty in respect of acts committed in time of war or of imminent threat of war. This penalty shall be applied only in the cases provided for by its law and in accordance with its provisions.
I am aware of that.
Well, then I have the following to say. What is said under Art. 1. Human dignity. That should be clear with point 1, which says, the right of every human being to life shall be protected by law, and further it says, the death penalty has been abolished. No one shall be condemned to that penalty or executed. But here now follows the glaring contradiction.
Killing shall not be considered a violation of this article if it is caused by the use of force strictly necessary to A. Defend someone against unlawful violence, B. Lawfully arrest someone or prevent someone who is lawfully deprived of their liberty from escaping. 14.12. 2007 Ian Official Journal of the European Union c. 303/17. Editor's note: the references to the article numbering of the treaties have been updated and some errors have been corrected. C. To put down a riot or insurrection lawfully. 4139b Ambo, Article 2 of Protocol Number 6 to the ECHR. A state may make provision in its law for the death penalty in respect of acts committed in time of war or of imminent threat of war. This penalty may be applied only in the cases provided for by its law and in accordance with its provisions.
This is more than just a contradiction, because in reality the whole thing is a very serious deception of the EU population, because with a deceptive distortion of the facts in a malicious, characterless, cunning and devious way a lie is interpreted as the truth, and the killing of human beings is made legal again as a punishment and protective measure, contrary to the people's decision that the death penalty should no longer exist.
For my part, I think that all the power-hungry people of the EU dictatorship know very well that parts of the populations of the states that are part of it will not be fooled forever and will sooner or later start to resist the dictatorship. So the EU dictatorship powers are, I think, roaringly and cowardly afraid that uprisings and riots will get them by the scruff of their neck. As you mentioned on the 5th of April, not in this, but in another way. And the hammer of the fact that the EU dictatorship has reintroduced the death penalty is that the EU dictatorship's parliamentary gang, which has to vote on laws and regulations, usually does not even know what the EU dictatorship's supreme dictators are actually voting on. I have found the following on the internet.
Posted by Honigman on 11.04. 09 in Politic.
What many people do not know, and most of all MEPs in the parliaments of EU countries, because they say they have never read the text in detail, we do not have time to read laws on which we vote. We rely on a summary by government experts, is that the Lisbon Treaty allows the death penalty to be carried out under certain circumstances. Professor Schachtschneider points out that the Lisbon Treaty can also reintroduce the death penalty, which is something every EU citizen should know. This is probably not explicitly stated in the text of the treaty, but hidden in a footnote which states, except in the event of war, insurrection, or civil commotion, in which case the death penalty is possible. Schachtschneider points out that this fact is scandalous, because they have this possibility built into a footnote of a footnote, and you have to read it carefully and be an expert to interpret it correctly. Who determines what a riot or insurrection is? The door is open for such an interpretation. Any demonstration in which some participants use violence could be described as such. Were the Monday demonstrations then also a riot? When people get together and demand the resignation of a government, throw stones at Parliament, as we have seen in Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece in recent months, is that revolt? Can the ringleaders be put up against the wall and executed or sentenced to death by a court? What is not explicitly forbidden by law can be interpreted by the state as it wishes, and EU law is above the law of individual EU member states. Besides, as governments say we are in a war, the war on terror, and in Afghanistan anyway. Here is an excerpt from an interview with Professor Schachtschneider, which he gave to the Germany debate. DD, keyword fundamental rights. You mentioned at the beginning that not even the right to life is reliably guaranteed by the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU Constitution, and that under certain circumstances the death penalty would be possible again. Schachtschneider: yes, let us come to fundamental rights, for example, the right to life, and look at this in detail. In Article 262 VV states no one may be sentenced to death, no one may be executed. All right, But this is not the truth. For the Constitutional Treaty states that the Declarations on Fundamental Rights, which were taken over in the Convention on Fundamental Rights under Roman Herzog with the text of the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, ECHR, and which were discussed at length in the Convention, have the same binding force as the fundamental rights text itself. Reality comes in the declarations. The Charter of Fundamental Rights is based, at least in the classical fundamental rights, on the ECHR of 1950, when it was probably no other option than to allow the many member states of the Council of Europe the option of the death penalty. Germany had just abolished the death penalty in 1949, but France, the United Kingdom, and many other states still had it, and a Declaration of Human Rights would never have come about if one had insisted on universal abolition of the death penalty. But now, after much discussion, not by mistake, this 1950 declaration was deliberately adopted as the authoritative declaration on the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And these declarations must be read and understood. They also state, first of all, that no one may be condemned to death or executed. But then come the explanations, including a killing shall not be regarded as a violation of this article if it has been caused by an act of violence which is absolutely necessary to defend someone against unlawful violence. All right, self-defense. To arrest someone lawfully or to prevent someone who is lawfully deprived of his liberty from escaping. That goes a long way, but then comes to put down a riot or insurrection lawfully. This is the situation in Leipzig, or a demonstration involving violence, which is seen as a riot or uprising. But that is not all. The declaration goes on to say, a state may provide in its law for the death penalty for acts committed in time of war or of imminent threat of war. This penalty may be applied only in cases provided for by law and in accordance with these provisions. Thus, the death penalty is possible in times of war or of imminent threat of war. Now the objection is raised. The death penalty, at least in Germany, is not in any law. Correct. But if the European Union makes implementing provisions for missions, that is to say war, for rapid reaction operations, if, for example, it makes arrangements for such a wartime situation which make the death penalty possible, then one can no longer say that this violates the fundamental rights of the EU Constitution. For this would have to be measured against this very declaration. There is therefore no longer any protection of the fundamental rights of life in the event of war or an immediate threat of war. Because these will be European legal acts, they are not to be measured against the German Basic Law Article 102 GG. The death penalty has been abolished, but against this. This means that the death penalty is possible and it will come. But I cannot blame anyone who does not spend his whole life dealing with public law and wrangling with European law when he does not notice anything. To read this work here, the EU Constitution, that is bodily injury, strange fundamental rights.
What is said here corresponds to what is real.
Then I have here excerpts that Patrick downloaded from the internet.
Excerpt from the following internet page, Gewalt Notruf Netzwerk e. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union allows the killing of human beings in riots. Obviously, the governments are expecting riots, said Professor M. Karl Albrecht Schachtschneider, expert in constitutional law.
To date, there have been no noteworthy reactions or outcry in the mainstream press with regard to this scandalous circumstance. Not even from our do-good politicians, who are otherwise so concerned about the observance of human rights. But obviously this only applies if you can point your finger at others. But it is a fact. The death penalty can be reintroduced in the EU, and demonstrators can also be shot at sharply in a crisis. The official journal of the European Union c. 303/17 to 303/18 of 14.12. 2007. Published explanatory notes to the Charter of Fundamental Rights concerning the death penalty. In relation to Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the Right to Life, it states, "Killing shall not be regarded as a violation of this article if it is caused by the use of force, which is absolutely necessary in order to a. Defend someone against unlawful violence, b. Arrest someone lawfully detained, or to prevent someone who is lawfully deprived of his liberty from escaping, c. Put down a riot or insurrection lawfully." The explanatory memorandum to Article 2 of Protocol No. 6 to the ECHR European Convention on Human Rights states unequivocally that a state may make provision in its law for the death penalty for acts committed in time of war or of imminent threat of war. This penalty may be applied only in the cases provided for by law and in accordance with its provisions. Excerpt from the following web page. Wikipedia Treaty of Lisbon. Allegation of an inadequate ban on the death penalty in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. 1 point of criticism in the public debate was the view that the Charter of Fundamental Rights would also allow the reintroduction of the death penalty in countries with an absolute banning. G. Germany or Austria? This accusation was based on the fact that, although Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the Charter states that no one may be condemned to the death penalty or executed, the explanatory notes to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which serve as an aid to interpretation and are not legally binding, interpret this prohibition in the sense of the European Convention on Human Rights, which, in the wording of the 6th Additional Protocol, permits inter alia the death penalty in a state of war and a killing to quell a riot. However, the vast majority of EU member states, including Germany and Austria, have already ratified the 13th Additional Protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights of the 3rd of May 2002, which prohibits the death penalty without exception in both peacetime and wartime. By virtue of the rule of interpretation in Article 52, Paragraph 3, and Article 53 of the Charter, the protection of fundamental rights under the Charter may in no case be less than that guaranteed by other applicable legal texts, in particular the constitutions of the member states or international conventions such as the European Convention on Human Rights. The Charter can therefore only introduce new fundamental rights, not reduce the existing protection of fundamental rights. In the German-speaking world, the accusation that the prohibition of the death penalty is inadequate has been made in particular in Karl Albrecht Schachtschneider's application to the German Federal Constitutional Court. However, the Constitutional Court did not address this aspect in the Lisbon decision. 3.
Excerpt from the following Internet page. NZ, Nuremberg newspaper. The EU opens a back door to the death penalty. State law expert warns against Lisbon Treaty. 03.09. 2009.
Nuremberg. He has lodged constitutional complaints against the Maastricht Treaty, the introduction of the Euro and the Lisbon Treaty, and has thus attracted a great deal of public attention in Germany. Professor Karl Albrecht Schachtschneider from Nuremberg. However, his warning that ratification of the Lisbon Treaty would allow the reintroduction of the death penalty in Europe in the event of wars is currently only attracting attention in Ireland. There, the second referendum on the Lisbon Treaty is scheduled for October. The NZ spoke with Professor Schachtschneider.
I am the Nuremberg newspaper.
I am Professor Karl Albrecht Schachtschneider from Nuremberg.
Article 102 of the German Basic Law states the death penalty is abolished. What does the Lisbon Treaty say?
The Lisbon Treaty itself is not the only problem. What is problematic is the associated Charter of Fundamental Rights, which would become legally binding upon final ratification of the treaty. In the explanations and negative definitions contained therein, the Charter explicitly allows for the reintroduction of the death penalty in the event of war or imminent threat of war. It also allows the killing of the human beings in order to quell an insurrection or revolt.
What exactly is written at the relevant place in the Charter of Fundamental Rights?
I should start by saying that, although Article 2, Paragraph 2 deals with the condemnation of the death penalty and the prohibition of executions, it is not clear how this is to be achieved. However, there is now a declaration on this article in the Lisbon Treaty, which originates from the 1950 Convention on Human Rights ECHR. It states that, inter alia, a killing is not considered a violation of this article if it is caused by the use of force necessary to defend someone against unlawful violence or to put down riot or insurrection lawfully. An accompanying protocol also states that a state may provide in its law for the death penalty for acts committed in time of war or of imminent threat of war. There is an explicit reference at one point to the fact that the explanation is drawn up as guidance for the interpretation of the Charter are to be given due consideration by the courts of the EU and the member states. There are two other places in the rules that support this.
This all sounds outrageous. Why has it not played a role in the public debate in Germany? Is it too insignificant because it is just pure theory? Schachtschneider, no, by no means. People think it is significant, but the governments have avoided anything to bring it into the public eye. This is a very precarious point, which is of course included in the commentary on the Lisbon Treaty. Reference is often made to the 13th additional protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights. This states that the death penalty should be abolished in all cases. Only, this additional protocol does not apply in all EU member states because 4 countries have not ratified it. Moreover, the very hidden referral technique of the Lisbon Treaty makes it clear that this additional protocol should not apply. On the whole, it must unfortunately be said that the critical passages are not inadvertently very hidden. What would a riot or uprising be? Would it also include the May Day demonstrations in Berlin-Kreuzberg?
The Monday demonstrations in Leipzig would have fallen into this category. In Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne, you can already see that there are conditions that are close to the border of unrest, and that should be called riot. At the moment, fortunately, nobody would think of letting EU policemen shoot at rioters. But it is not entirely out of the question that over time, social tensions will increase even further and conditions will become more turbulent. If things became even more critical, even civil war-like, which I hope they will not, such possibilities would come into play. After all, the Lisbon Treaty is designed in such a way that in the long term, its authorizations will make it possible to transfer police responsibility largely into the hands of the EU.
What conditions would have to be met for police officers to be allowed to shoot rioters?
The regulations would have to be made by the EU. Only then would European fundamental rights be relevant. German institutions would have to apply the European regulations.
What about the death penalty for wars and threats of war?
This would also require an EU legal act. The Council of Ministers is authorized to adopt provisions on the execution of missions. Missions are wars. The so-called peace missions, the fight against terror, are fine words for the right to war, for war missions. The implementation for such future missions initiated by the Union, the current Afghanistan mission, on the other hand, is initiated by the United Nations, is decided by the Council of Ministers. If the Bundeswehr is to be deployed, the Bundestag must give its approval. In the implementing regulations, everything that serves the success of military measures can be regulated.
If the death penalty were to be introduced in war, against whom could it be imposed?
Against partisans, terrorists, perhaps also against soldiers who sabotage or fail to fulfill their duties.
Does Germany now have a possibility to take countermeasures?
That is very difficult, but not impossible. The legal problem is that the abolition of the death penalty is part of the basic law, but not a fundamental right. The death penalty does not only exist in dictatorships, but also in one of the world's leading democracies. I do not see any possibility of legal protection against making the death penalty possible. The Federal Constitutional Court did not address this point in my constitutional complaint against the Lisbon Treaty.
But there are other ways.
It is a political question that would have to be decided politically. The Bundestag and Bundesrat could take the path of international law and enter a so-called reservation. They would have to declare that the explanations on Article 2 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights have no effect for Germany.
But then the regulation would only be excluded in Germany, and the individual member states could follow suit country by country.
That would be conceivable. But it would be even better to amend the Lisbon Treaty. Germany could take the initiative.
Excerpt from the following web page, European Union External Service.
The European Union takes a clear and unequivocal position on the death penalty. The abolition of the death penalty is a central objective of EU human rights policy. And of course, the abolition of the death penalty is a prerequisite for accession to the Union. Indeed, the EU plays a leading role in the fight against the death penalty and is also the world's largest donor of funds for action in this field. This commitment is already reflected in the EU guidelines on the death penalty, the very first human rights guidelines adopted by the Council in 1998. The High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, Catherine Ashton, has also stated that the abolition of the death penalty worldwide is her personal priority. The death penalty is cruel and inhuman and has been shown to be an inadequate deterrent to crime. The European Union considers that the abolition of the death penalty contributes to the enhancement of human dignity and the progressive development of all human rights. As a first step towards abolition, the EU accepts a moratorium where appropriate. The adoption of a UN General Assembly resolution on this issue in 2007 was a major breakthrough in the fight against the death penalty. The growing support for subsequent resolutions in 2008 and 2010 confirmed the global trend against the death penalty. The EU calls on countries where the death penalty is still used to progressively reduce it. It insists that the death penalty should only be used in accordance with international minimum standards. The EU intervenes both in individual cases and at the general political level when a country's policy on the death penalty changes. In 2009 alone, the EU issued statements on 30 individual cases and carried out more than 30 other actions on persons facing execution. The EU also provides funding to non-governmental organisations working against the death penalty. Projects can range from monitoring the use of the death penalty to prisoner assistance, support for constitutional reform, training, advocacy, and awareness-raising campaigns. CIF, Brussels, the 10th of April 2014.
Excerpt from the following internet page, Wikipedia or subsidiarity.
Allegation of disregard for the principle of subsidiarity in European legal practice. The German expert in constitutional law, Rupert Schulz, accused the European Union, especially its Commission, using the catchword expertocracy, of increasingly disempowering the national parliaments of the EU states by disregarding the principle of subsidiarity. In order to solve the problem, he proposed to reorganize the right to vote in the European Parliament according to the principle of one man, one vote, thereby strengthening its democratic legitimacy and to give it primacy over the European Commission, which still has the right of initiative in the European Union's legislature. Commissioners should also be deprived of their alleged inclination to extend their powers by the fact that they will in future be elected by the national parliaments.
The EU is undoubtedly a vicious dictatorship and is also to be called such. It hypocritically calls itself a peace union. But it is in no way a peace union because, to the contrary, it causes a great deal of disharmony and discord among the human beings who belong to the rational and reasonable EU states. The machinations of the EU dictatorship are in the highest form hostile to democracy and peace. Underhanded, dishonest, mendacious, and only aimed at power for those who hold the scepter in the dictatorship. This fact is not only not recognized by all EU fanatics of all EU states and thus also by Switzerland, but also not by many EU parliamentarians who, due to their blindness to the EU dictatorship, do not even realize that they are serving a dictatorship juggernaut. This is also proven by the fact that many of the parliamentarians blindly trust and affirmatively acknowledge the voting proposals presented to them without studying them and without knowing their real content. And how this is exploited by the highest and most senior dictatorship officials is also shown in relation to the reintroduction of the death penalty, the vote on which was so tricky and confusing that it is simply incomprehensible to the honest and reasonable human beings. In fact, it shows not only the hypocrisy of EU dictatorship parliamentarians, but also their cowardly fear, as well as their greed for power and their unscrupulous deviousness. The background to the reintroduction of the death penalty in relation to riots, demonstrations, and unrest, etc., is fundamentally based on the fact that EU dictators have used the death penalty as a precautionary measure to protect them from such popular movements through murderous military intervention and action. The EU is an absolutely undemocratic and criminal multi-state dictatorship organization, which is directed and led solely by power-hungry people. And with the reintroduction of the death penalty, the term criminal is no longer applicable, because the EU has indeed become a criminal organization by permitting the legal killing of human beings under EU law. All laws, rules and regulations, etc., according to which the European dictatorial parliament is elected, do not correspond in any way to any basic democratic requirements, but only to a bare dictatorship, which is only able to keep itself in power by threats, military force and the death penalty, etc., and as far as the right to a say in the dictatorship is concerned, the dictators-in-chief also hold the reins of power, so they determine whose voice is more or less important for which EU states. However, a true democracy requires that each vote counts for the same amount of money, which is not the case in the EU dictatorship, because the votes of citizens of different countries, such as Luxembourg, Belgium, or Malta, count for more than those of Germany, England, France, and Italy, etc. This means that there is no European sovereign, but only the suzerain of the EU dictatorship itself, which therefore exercises supreme and superior power over the whole dictatorship union. Every organ of the EU dictatorship places itself above the will of every member people, every citizen, and every government of every EU member state. The EU dictatorship is nothing more and nothing less than a failed project of megalomaniacs, and moreover this union is not only undemocratic but also criminal, as I said. The constitutional treaty enshrines a rule of the EU dictatorship over the sovereign. But this is democratically impossible, and consequently democracy has been crushed and driven into the servitude of the EU dictatorship. However, those who speak and defend these truths are harassed by the stupid and irresponsible EU dictatorship fanatics and defamed, discriminated against and notorious as enemies of peace, nationalists and as enemies of Europe and enemies of democracy. But it has long since become clear that it is the Europe fanatics or EU dictatorship fanatics who, in their stupidity and irrationality, are the real enemies of democracy and freedom, who moreover betray their own country and homeland and want to sell them to the EU dictatorship for pathologically stupid, contemptible, and irresponsible delusions, and even give them away as gifts.
You have got into the habit of talking about the EU only as an EU dictatorship.
It is a dictatorship, and it must also be called that.
In addition to all that you have said, I can only advise that the human beings should not let the Europe fanatics chase them down the foxhole. Especially not all those Swiss people who cannot think beyond their nose when it comes to EU crime and EU flirting. Swiss people, do not let yourselves be taken in by the EU dictatorship, as many other states have done and would like to be freed from the EU juggernaut when their rulers and the EU fanatics allow it. But in relation to the death penalty, I found the following very interesting article on the internet. Written by FIGU passive member Achim Wolf from Germany, and as far as I know, also published by FIGU, but in the context of the EU death penalty is certainly worth republishing.
Death penalty, the suffering of the executioners, and why the death penalty is murderous.
On 31.10. 2006, a German-language TV station broadcast an American documentary about the execution of the death penalty in the USA. In this documentary, several prison directors, executioners, and pastors were interviewed in a neutral, non-judgmental way who do their job in US prisons, where the death penalty is carried out. It was shown that, and in what way, all those involved suffered from the psychological consequences of the executions. Among the executioners, who had to kill the prisoners by injecting poison, all of them suffered from more or less strong remorse and wondered whether they were doing the correct thing by doing their job. One of the professional executioners justified himself with the argument that he was only executing the laws that were decided by the state. And since according to the Bible, especially the Old Testament, all human decisions are determined and controlled by God, he was convinced that he was only the executive instrument of this divine will. This God's will requires the human beings to put the Old Testament's demand an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth into practice to the letter. The fundamental point about the death penalty is that no human being and no society is entitled to send other human beings to their death on the basis of any rules, regulations, or laws. It does not matter whether the human beings murder someone of their own accord and for personal reasons, or whether they act on the orders of a court, a state authority, a president, the military, a dictator, a king, or other human powers, or whether they carry out or allow their gruesome craft to be carried out in the name of imaginary figures such as God, devil, and demons, etc. A fundamental recommendation of the creation clearly states that the human being should not kill in degeneration. See the book, Decalogue Dodecalogue, published by FIGU, Wassermann-Zeit Verlag. Killing a human being is only permissible as a last resort in pure self-defense, in order to protect one's own life or the life of another human being from a deadly attack. In each individual case, it is dependent on the situation whether the human beings defending or being attacked can use other means to defend themselves against the attacker without having to kill him. depending on the circumstances, the danger can perhaps be averted simply by using good words to appease the attacker if the attacker is a single human being. If the mind and reason of the attacker are still responsive, the stirring storm of his thoughts, emotions, and feelings may be smoothed to the point where he abandons his deadly intention. If he does not respond to this, and if he also cannot be put out of action by external force to such an extent that he has to let go of his intention, then, as a last resort, killing in pure self-defense is allowed. Every living being is an extremely precious good of creation, which has created all life through its pure neutral energy and keeps it alive through the cosmic electrical life energy. As a self-evolving creature of universal consciousness, the human beings have a special position in the universe. As Omadam, law and fulfiller, he has the responsible task of evolving his consciousness and spirit, and thus contributing to the evolution of creation, into which he will one day enter after a long period of development. As the most highly developed life form in the universe, it is incumbent upon him to carefully and fairly preserve, promote, and protect all human, faunal, and floral life. Nevertheless, in often religiously motivated delusions of grandeur, the human being self-importantly disregards the wise recommendations of the creation and, contrary to nature, determines the life and death of fallible human beings. This contemptuous attitude towards life and human beings also bears witness to the primitive, vindictive way of thinking of the human beings who approve of the death penalty and carry it out if necessary. Such people thus prove whose spirit child and what kind of human beings they are, namely irresponsible and in the deepest depths of their being cowardly and incapable of life, which do not yet do justice to the true meaning of the term human being in any way. The imposition and execution of the death penalty and its mere advocacy are inhumane. If the human beings have killed or murdered one or many lives in a moment of passion, in a blood frenzy, as a result of psychological or consciousness damage, or with a planned and cold intention, not one iota of what has happened can be reversed by executing the perpetrator for punishment and forcibly transporting him to the next world. On the contrary, new injustice is added to the crime that has already taken place, which is in no way inferior to destructive murder. Killing in the penal system, legitimized by human laws and regulations, is in fact nothing more than the hateful, cowardly and bloodthirsty act of cold vengeance, whereby the advocates, supporters, and executors of the death penalty degrade themselves into despicable creatures. Ever since religions and religious sects have existed, their founders, guardians, advocates, bonzes, followers, and believers, as well as many so-called secular powers, have justified their actions with the alleged will of an imaginary creator god. This all-dominant god is said to be filled with infinite love and care for his weak creatures, but he absurdly allows his earthly representatives to immediately resort to draconian punishment, terror, murder, and bloody retribution if one of his beloved flocks dares to question the illogical and inhuman recommendations and dogmas which are supposedly created by him, or even to doubt his existence. In the past, the human beings were spied upon, persecuted, terrorized, and possibly inflicted with cruel punishments by religionists, sect gurus, and their henchmen when they doubted such an irascible, unjust, and punishing God. The fact that a creator God who cries out for revenge and punishment, who acts illogically and feels perverse never existed and never can exist, is obvious to every healthy, thinking human being who is at least rudimentarily capable of the powers of his intellect, his reason, and his consciousness. Such a God was and is only the reflection of pathologically degenerated human thinking. which projects all evil into a divine fantasy figure in order to frighten the human beings, whereby they can be misled and exploited in every way. It is not given to any human beings to present themselves as a will-less instrument in the name of an avenging Creator God, also not to executioners who murder on behalf of human justice and thereby trample their personal responsibility underfoot and hide their conscience behind a non-existent divine power to which they self-denyingly sacrifice themselves. Executioners allow themselves to be dishonorably abused for the evil purposes of political and religious powers to whom the life of a human being means nothing, and who, as always, talk about charity, peace, freedom, humanity, forgiveness, and justice, but in reality practice the exact opposite, namely primitive revenge, inhuman persecution and punishment, torture, rape, murder, and manslaughter. About 2,000 years ago, the prophet Emmanuel said, "By their fruits you shall know them. The fruits of religions and politics look tasty and juicy, but in their interior they harbor only rot, stench, betrayal, decay, and death, as has been and is proven by millions of tortures, assassinations, executions, burning of witches, etc., especially by the Holy Inquisition of the Roman Catholic Church and all other Christian religions and sects since the beginning of their existence. Proponents, supporters and practitioners of the death penalty, whether of their own free will or in the name of a state, the authorities or a god, religion or sect, are guilty of a crime against the laws of nature and must henceforth live with the inevitable consequences of their actions. The human beings are a part of the universe in which everything is connected and interwoven through the spirit and love of creation. Thus he cuts into his own flesh, as it were, when he kills other human beings in violation of the law and order of creation. In the case of the hangmen and their henchmen, it is lifelong remorse that keeps the human beings from resting. In their consciousness or subconscious, they know that they are or have been committing injustice, and that it is not their right to criminally destroy the life of another human being created by creation. Every human being should be able to live his life to the fulfillment of evolution until his natural end, because the meaning of his existence rests in the incessant, conscious and spiritual evolution through countless rebirths. If, however, the human beings are taken away from life by force and without acute need, all possibilities of their personal evolution in the present life are taken away from them by evil violence. He therefore has no more chance in life to recognize, process, and correct his mistakes. With the extinction of the present life, the fallible human beings is out of sight and out of mind, but his thinking, emotions, feeling, speaking, working, and acting, etc., remain as information in the subtle memory levels. Since the human beings are no longer able to rethink and neutralize their mistakes as a result of their murder, the new personality connected with their spirit form must work through this with greater effort in the following life, in order to be able to process and dissolve everything at some point. The next personality, the new material consciousness, is completely new and unencumbered after the next reincarnation of the spirit form, but is impulsively hit by unprocessed things from the previous personality. The new personality must then consciously or unconsciously cope with the processing and neutralization of the impulses that hit it. Human evolution thus continues after death and cannot be stopped by death either, because the spirit is immaterial and imperishable. The death penalty cannot therefore be a measure of wrongdoing against human beings, but the punishment must consist in isolating the delinquents from the rest of humanity for the rest of their lives. They can be taken to suitable places where they can make a living by their own efforts, physically unharmed, and rethink their mistakes. A human being who is aware of the fact of the rebirth of the human being's spirit form can no longer see any sense in the death penalty. He has learnt that the human beings cannot evade their self-responsibility under any circumstances, and he is aware that suicide cannot be the solution to any problems. The human beings can and must overcome all difficulties and challenges on their path through life from within themselves, through the power of their intellect, reason, and consciousness. A cowardly escape from life temporarily postpones his problems, but he cannot solve or neutralize them. The following personality of his incarnation line has to process the impulses that hit it in order to neutralize the unprocessed things. In this context, it should also be said that any active euthanasia is also murder or assisted suicide and is therefore inadmissible. A strict distinction must be made between this and passive euthanasia, which is permitted or even correct when, for example, machines are switched off that prevent a human being from dying naturally, or that even merely maintain the function of the organs. In the TV reportage mentioned at the beginning, another executioner spoke openly about his problems in dealing with the conscious killing of human beings. He said that with every execution, he finds it harder to continue with the executions. He complained about sleep problems and the increasing health burden of his work. He knew of no one who was better off after the execution of the human beings than before. Everyone felt worse, and none of them looked better, including himself. Among the executioners and their helpers, there are always men who become chronically ill due to the psychological stress, get heart attacks and strokes, and do not want to do the job anymore because they just cannot cope with everything anymore. Another man, who used to work as an executioner, said that at the time when he was still doing his job, he was absolutely convinced of correctness. During the interview, the camera recorded a crying and psychologically burdened man who had stopped the execution at some point because his nervous powers were at an end. It took him 2 years after the end of this activity to process the experiences from his job and the consequences that affected him. Today, he is absolutely convinced that it is wrong to kill human beings with punishment, no matter whether the law or the state requires it or not. Using the example of this former executioner, it became clear to the audience that the human beings cause suffering, pain and illness to themselves consciously, psychologically and physically when they are tempted by a human authority or in the name of an imaginary god to kill other human beings on order. The man suffered psychologically from the consequences of his profession, and as an attentive observer, one could only find compassion and deep regret for him. His self-respect could only be partially regained through his honesty and remorse for his deeds under great psychological pain. He had renounced his old convictions regarding the death penalty in time and had thrown off the oppressive burden of false dogmas that had kept his conscience in bondage for years. It was the commendable behavior of a man who, after a hard inner struggle, had changed his attitude to a venerable way of thinking and feeling. The example of this man proves that it is never too late for the human beings to learn from their mistakes and to correct them, if they are only willing and courageous enough to admit them to themselves and to deal with them. In another scene, a pastor who accompanied the death row inmates on the day of their deaths told of his experiences. Before their execution, the death row inmates repeatedly sought his comfort, his encouragement and his physical closeness, while they lay tied and strapped on the plank bed, which they were not to leave alive. Once, a doomed man looked into his eyes for help until the deadly poison injected into his veins took effect, and he breathed his last. The pastor held the trembling hand of the dying man until he could no longer squeeze it, and he died before his eyes. The remembrance of this was so close to him that he could neither forget it nor classify it as morally correct. Nevertheless, he did not seem to be ready to fully admit the injustice of the death penalty and to reject it with all its personal consequences. He should have seriously considered the possibility that his allegedly just and infallible creator God could be a delusion, which would have burst the delusion of the dear God like a soap bubble and caused his religious worldview to collapse without any foundation. In summary, it is to be said that all the executioners, their helpers, prison wardens and pastors, etc., shown in the report felt that they were doing the wrong thing, which naturally weighed on their conscience and psyche. This, in turn, led to stress, mental disorders, depression, and illness. The individual way of dealing with the pangs of conscience was as different as the human beings themselves. One hid behind the authority of an alleged God who had written down his desire for revenge in the Holy Scripture of Christianity and demanded its cruel implementation by the human beings. The other men openly admitted to themselves and their interviewers that they had suffered from their job. And then there was the man who no longer wanted to lie to himself and finally recognized the horrendous nonsense of the state laws and religious dogmas that had led him to kill other human beings. He hung up his deadly profession once and for all and fought for relief from his hitherto suppressed conscience. At the end of the reportage, George W. Bush was shown outed as the President of the United States in front of an audience as a relentless supporter of the death penalty. And it was mentioned that as governor of Texas, he had rejected numerous clemency requests from death row inmates and had the death penalty carried out on them. In doing so, G.W. Bush has arrogantly and high-handedly ignored human rights and all creative law. In not a single case did he make any effort to get to know the human beings condemned to death personally and to deal with the crimes they were accused of in an impartial manner. He saw and still sees himself as the earthly representative of his almighty Christian God, whose vengeful will he wants to enforce by all means in his insane delusion. Among the human beings who were sent to their deaths by him as the ultimate responsible authority were also completely innocent people, whom he robbed of their lives in wicked injustice and presumptuous self-importance. This behavior reflects a megalomaniacal human beings and creation-despising attitude of consciousness, which originates from a sick brain. Bush has shown the whole world that this is indeed the case by criminally instigating the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, to which he felt personally called by God. He brought and still brings thousands of deaths, injuries, mutilations, and roaring misery to the human beings in whose countries he has invaded with his bloodthirsty armies. Whoever does not want to silently tolerate this inhuman activity and has become aware of his creative duties as a human being should, as far as possible, oppose the death penalty and call by name, and fight against all other ways of thinking, views, ideologies, etc., which are contemptuous of human beings and creation.
I also think that Occam's article should be mentioned again in the context discussed.
I think it is really important because his words are important. But look here, there is still a reader's question and the answer from me. The whole thing just rhymes somehow with the discussed topic. Please read it and tell me what you think.
Reader's question, the newly published special bulletin number 77, moves me very much. Now, finally, I was able to formulate a question that Billy might like to take up briefly in a bulletin. When I read the articles in which Billy talks about climate change and climate destruction, and once again calls for a radical worldwide halt to births so that the cause of all ills. overpopulation, and the accompanying destruction of the basis of life for human beings. Animals and the environment on the earth could be reduced and contained. My stomach becomes quite queasy. There is talk of know-it-alls, adversaries, fools and antagonists of the great majority of human beings, which is accompanied by irrationality, arrogance, gigantism and megalomania of the human beings who live in lies and deceit, filled with hatred, greed, lust and addiction, with murder, war and other crimes and acts of violence. Billy speaks of human action as diabolical, calls it madness, and calls the path that humanity is on the path of destruction. I am shocked. I am furious. I am insecure. I am confused. Billy calls war a crime. After having had many conversations, I have come to the conclusion that many human beings consider rearmament, preparing to destroy and kill, and acts of war killing as legitimate when it comes to securing or increasing the shortage of available resources worldwide for their own use. Of course, it is undeniable. Where there is a lack of habitats, healthy livelihoods, or other resources, life cannot develop in a healthy way. Careful planning is a prerequisite for success. My question: why do the majority of human beings consider the planning of the killing of human beings, the production and distribution of war material as legitimate, while the careful prevention and precaution in accordance with the available resources and the demand for a worldwide birth control, which would be able to restore the lack of balance, is considered a crime? I'm grateful for a few words of clarification. Best wishes and Salome, Edith Schuler, Switzerland.
Answer: the rearming in preparation for killing and the effective acts of war as the actual killing of human beings is, according to the laws and recommendations of creation and nature, by no means legitimate, as the human beings of the earth unfortunately see it elsewhere, and believe to understand that they are also entitled to kill their fellow human beings for whatever false, egoistic, jealous, hateful, vengeful, revengeful, power-hungry, belligerent, punitive, or other inhuman and hostile reasons. And in this respect, religions and sects play a decisive role, namely through the invention of the feeble-minded fairy tale that there is an all-loving God who created the world, the sun, the stars, and all that exists, thus giving root to the false doctrine and horror story that it is not the laws of nature that are the origin of all things, but God. And with the so loving God Father, who is supposed to be indulgent and just, and to bear the responsibility for all that exists, the wrath of God was also thought up in a paradoxical and contradictory way, who punishes everything and anything with severe punishment, which violates his orders, commands, decrees, and recommendations, whereby, as the last sequence, with regard to punishment, even bodily mutilation, and even the death penalty of the right and legitimate, are supposed to be the last. And all this nonsense has been woven into the education of children since time immemorial, so that from an early age they are confronted with the lie of God and with egoism, hatred, revenge and retribution, death and war, as well as with selfishness, self-importance, jealousy, power, etc., and also with envy, unkindness, indifference, selfishness, irresponsibility, because it is passed on to God, and fear of the wrathful God. The morbidly stupid, illogical, and contradictory lie that there is a God who is goodness and love itself also legitimizes the fact that he alone determines everything, and therefore has the sole right to demand punishment, revenge and retribution for misdeeds in many ways, including bodily mutilations and death for other faiths, for offenses, adultery, mistakes, apostasy, guilt, injustice, crimes and offenses, etc., but also war against hostile or simply unbelieving human beings, groups, and peoples. Thus, it is only because of this very insanity of the religious sectarian delusion of God that the majority of humanity on earth is struck with fear, misery, suffering, distress, and horror, in addition to the fact that the earth is a malignant place of horror for large parts of the human beings as a result of torture, war, death, and destruction, as well as the consequences of globalization and overpopulation. In addition to this, many severe blows of fate have to be endured because natural disasters shake the world, brought about by the human beings of the earth themselves, through the all-round effects of the maddening overpopulation which has been, and continues to be, destructive to the laws of nature, to fauna and flora, to the climate, and even to the planet itself. The deluded, the believers in God, believe that they could bear everything better if they believed in an imaginary God and prayed to him for correction and prevention of all evils, as it has been the case since ancient times, when the ancestors conceived of an imaginary God to fearfully place themselves under his protection, but who was also supposed to help them in every way, but never asked for any help from him. Precisely because God is only an imaginary fantasy created by human beings out of fear, which does not and never will have any vitality, energy, or power. Therefore, in primeval times, the imaginary figure of God was conceived by man and lifted onto an invisible pedestal as protector and punisher, from where he is to rule over the human beings as individuals and also as a mass in divine love and wisdom, but also in wrath and punishment. This was conceived by the human beings of the earth in this way. Instead of thinking of themselves, their own strength, and their own ability, and trying to act in a helpful and useful way in their own way, and on their own initiative. Since they did not do this, however, and since they did not reflect on their innermost neutral positive being, and thus also disregarded the creational natural laws and recommendations which determined their inner being, they sought in their fear an imaginary benevolent God-Father who would reward them and preserve and redeem them from all evil and evil. At the same time, however, in their unreasonableness and in their stupidity, they also created a punishing and avenging illusory figure, God, in this imaginary God, who since then has been punishing human beings for their misconduct or their belief in God, angrily and furiously through acts of retribution, or has them persecuted and killed by people who have fallen into a religious habit, also through religious terrorism, witch hunts, religious persecution, religious murders, and religious wars. Well, God is also only an idol, like other idols, because he is also only a fantasy ghost invented by human beings, which the human beings of the earth, depending on religion and sect, instrumentalized for their purposes according to their own wishes and needs. However, since time immemorial contradictions have been as unavoidable as they are today, as well as the fact that collectively whole peoples have been brought to their senses by war, oppression and enslavement through violence, death, coercion, and inhuman punishment, as is also attempted today by religious sectarian terror. In this way, whole tribes and peoples were exterminated, which from time immemorial never corresponded to the creational natural laws and recommendations, for these make it absolutely clear that neither misery caused by human beings nor torture, violence, suffering, coercion, death, and war make any sense, but only love, peace, freedom, and harmony to the contrary. If, however, all the inhuman, unworthy things are done nevertheless, then they correspond to completely out of touch, inhuman, and creation unnatural degenerations, which never have any justification and are only carried out by degenerate human beings who have become addicted to sheer egoism, to complete inhumanity, self-glory and selfishness, to the lust for power and all other human beings and life degeneration. If in this respect, as in all other respects and on all sides, the natural laws and recommendations of creation are maliciously broken and disregarded, it is only out of false egoism, greed for power, selfishness, self-importance and greed, as well as out of false mental and emotional impulses, which are not only absolutely illogical from the point of view of understanding and reason, but are also completely abnormal and degenerate from a human point of view, and which blatantly contradict the true innermost creational natural given being, then only abnormal evil and degenerate negativity arises, which can never be legitimized. However, it is precisely in this respect that the human beings of the earth are acting in a way that degenerates into selfishness, and behaving in a way from which they see only themselves and their own advantages in their selfishness, disregarding all humanity and trampling it underfoot. Truthfully, the human beings of the earth, at least the majority of earthly humanity, have maneuvered themselves into a state of egoism, complete indifference, self-importance, selfishness, and unscrupulousness to such an extent that they neither understand nor know what the high values of true love, peace, freedom, and harmony are effective. In fact, he can no longer recognize these values at all, and he no longer even knows what they mean, because he only knows these concepts from hearsay and from reading, so he can no longer really understand them, let alone realize them. As a result, the mindful prevention and precautionary approach to the production of offspring from purely selfish and autocratic, selfish and irresponsible ways of thinking, feeling, acting, and behaving is also rejected. But this is also based on the fact that, out of the same misconduct, there is also a vehement refusal to do anything, both intellectually and rationally, on a purely personal and private basis, which is in accordance with the correct and overall welfare of all humanity, nature and its fauna and flora, as well as the climate and the planet itself. Basically, everything and anything good and positive is done in a purely degenerated, egoistic way, only for one's own person and well-being, far away from any interhumanly valuable thought and feeling for the individual human beings and the whole of humanity. The false and dangerous reasoning is based on the fact that what is private in nature should remain private, including the witnessing of descendants of one's own free will, regardless of whether the overpopulation and the resulting catastrophic consequences endanger and ultimately destroy the entire earthly existence and all life, including nature, fauna, flora, and human beings, as well as the climate and even the planet itself, but also every possibility of life and survival. It is precisely because of this stupid view and opinion, which are based on sheer degenerated egoism, power behavior, self-importance, selfishness, greed, and comprehensive irresponsibility, that controlled birth control is rejected. And all these mentioned unworthy values are also the reason why the human beings take the undue right to kill and murder their fellow human beings, and to legitimize these criminal actions and deeds by divine guidelines. However, there are also other inhuman factors involved, such as jealousy, hatred, revenge, and vengeance, which are commonplace among the human beings of the earth in a completely degenerate way and know no bounds. All these, among many other things, are reasons why the majority of the earthly humanity considers the planning and execution of the killing of human beings, the production and distribution of weapons, and the arming of war materials, as well as the waging of war, to be legitimate. And these are the same reasons why the careful and urgently needed prevention of procreation is seen as a purely private matter and thus a worldwide controlled birth control is vehemently rejected. And it is again the same reasons that do not prevent the available resources from being further exploited and squandered by overpopulation, thus making it impossible for future descendants to make controlled use of the Earth's resources. So it is also for all the reasons mentioned that all around nature, the climate and the whole planet, the lack of balance cannot be restored. This means that everything that would be reasonable and rational to restore the balance of nature, the fauna and flora, the climate and the planet, which has been completely destroyed by the human beings of the Earth, out of sheer stupidity and stupidness as well as out of selfishness, greed, power behavior, selfishness, self-importance, and irresponsibility, is seen by the human beings of the Earth as injustice or even as a crime, as well as a worldwide controlled birth control. Sim-Ya Say, Silver Star Center, the 30th of May 2014. 23.43 hours, Billy.
As usual, I think the whole thing is good, so nothing more needs to be added because everything is clearly laid out. But it is always interesting to see how far-reaching some Earth humans let their thoughts and feelings wander and formulate valuable questions, which they pass on to you for answering.
That is indeed the case. And the whole thing we have been talking about so far, I think it will probably be good for a special bulletin.
It will be.
Then I have something here that Bernadette found on the internet, and I would like to know what I think about it. If you want to read it, please.
Ta reads.
The whole thing is interesting, but it only corresponds to a profound experiment which allows certain conclusions to be drawn and is noteworthy, but does not correspond to a beginning. The whole way of research in relation to beaming, as it is called and understood in Earth humans, still has a long way to go, so it will take a long time before the first real successes will be achieved, which will also lead on.
This is also clear to me why the statements in the 2 internet articles seem euphoric and a bit pretentious to me.
Which I can understand and also agree with you.
Sometimes a question that interests me in a different direction. The first human beings of the early days did not have weapons with which they could have gone hunting to kill animals. How did they manage to kill animals anyway? When I think about it like this, I always come up with 3 ideas that I can take into consideration. Firstly, that their distant ancestors surprised animals in their sleep, or secondly, that they caught them in traps, or thirdly, that they set them to death.
These were indeed the 3 forms of hunting when early humans had no weapons. The principles of using traps and catching animals in their sleep still partly exist today, but also the rushing of animals. Today, however, the method of hounding is usually only used to catch animals with lassos or to drive them into special enclosures. Early man, however, chased the animals to the point of complete exhaustion and death, with the overheating of the animals in particular leading to their death by heat stroke. Because the chase was no longer able to cool their bodies by panting, as the panting cannot be carried out during escape, but only in a state of rest. The fact is that the animals usually regulate their temperature by panting because they cannot sweat. If the animals are put to flight and chased, it is no longer possible for them to pant, and as a result, they overheat their bodies and eventually succumb to heat stroke. For many animals, panting is therefore a very important part of their body's thermoregulation and a substitute for sweating. Many animals can only sweat to a very limited extent due to their small number of sweat glands. This also has an advantage because no electrolytes, note Billy. Minerals, salts, bulk elements are released or sweated out, as is normally the case with sweating. So when animals pant, the physiological dead space, or the part of the breathing air that is not involved in the gas exchange in the lungs, increases. In this way, the same amount of air is moved more frequently and moisture and heat are released. This changes the number of breaths, but at the same time, the volume of air per minute remains the same. In contrast to the animals, the human beings are the only living beings with a pronounced ability to perspire which enables them, in contrast to the animals, to regulate their body temperature in this way. For him, sweating is a natural function, whereby he has 2 to 3 million sweat glands under the skin for the thermal regulation of his entire body. The autonomic nervous system plays a major role in this and functions unconsciously, as it is responsible for the sweating mechanism. So it is no wonder that many human beings sweat, especially when they fall into a stressful situation, which irritates the autonomic nervous system. Sweating, however, basically fulfills many functions in the human body. On the one hand, excess heat is released during sweating, which regulates the temperature. But sweating also has a signaling effect via the sense of smell, whereby it also secretes pheromones or sexual scents, which play an important role in sexual arousal and reproduction. Sweat also helps to maintain the skin's protective acid mantle, as lipids contribute to the skin's hydration.
But it is of course also the case that the human beings can be so rushed that they become completely exhausted and can die from it.
This is indeed the case, and a life-threatening loss of salt and minerals, etc. Heart failure and thirst can also be the cause of death, as well as a purely organic, complete breakdown of energy when the human beings are rushed too much.
There are also enough reports from different times that the human beings were hounded and persecuted until their organism failed and they just dropped dead or died in agony. But now I have a question about all the medicinal substances, especially the hormones that get into water and groundwater. Especially the hormones in drinking water, as well as other substances excreted by human beings, affect other human beings, but also animals and creatures, which of course drink from the hormone-impregnated water. Can you tell me what the main effect of hormone-contaminated water is on men in particular? And whether there is a way to neutralize the hormones in the water and make it clean again?
The hormones contained in drinking water are not only harmful to men, but also to women, children, and young people of both sexes. But I can briefly answer your question regarding men by saying that the hormones absorbed through the water impair fertility on the one hand, but that they also lead to abdominal obesity and the formation of male breasts in particular. Although there are other consequences to be mentioned, the three mentioned are the main manifestations. In animals and all living things, 2. The hormones brought into the drinking water by the human beings cause various changes, including various mutations, and it is worth noting that such changes and mutations also occur in human descendants. Both the female and male parents are involved in bringing along the hormonal causes and their effects, because the hormones absorbed through the water are also deposited in the sperm of the man, as well as in the ovaries, and thus in the individual egg of the woman. This is one of the main reasons why a very large number of human, animal, and zootechnical offspring are born worldwide with organic and also consciousness-related damage, and with various mutation effects. And with regard to whether there is a possibility of purifying drinking water contaminated by hormones and other substances and turning it into clean water again, as you say, there is a good way of doing this, which consists in subjecting drinking water to ozone washing, which can be carried out, for example, by means of appropriate ozone filters through which all hormonal and also various other substances are neutralized. The most important measure, however, would undoubtedly be for Earth humans to use all these hormones, etc., as well as all antibiotics, in a purely rational way and to treat the relevant wastewater from the outset, before it can be discharged into a sewage network and later into a water distribution network.
That would mean, as I understand it, that measures would have to be taken and implemented, such as dedicated filters to neutralize human excreta before it is sent to the distribution network and then to water treatment plants, which would also have to be equipped with filters to be on the safe side.
You have understood it correctly. But the ideal case would be if all these substances were used in a purely rational way. Hormone substances, such as birth control pills, may well be a means of contraception, but in the form in which they are produced and used by Earth humans, they do more harm than good. There is an urgent need to research and create a natural medicine in this respect, which does not contain hormones, but regulates contraception in a natural way.
And there are plenty of such natural substances on Earth, but you are not allowed, by your directives, to name the plants from which the substances can be extracted, as you once said.
That is correct, but on the other hand, various earthly peoples know of corresponding plants which can be used for contraception. Unfortunately, however, the pharmaceutical companies are not interested in researching and working in this direction, because they would lose billions by discontinuing their contraceptive pills.
There is no doubt about it. But let me ask you a different question. Last time we talked about India and the rapes that have taken place there. And also about young girls and women being sold, robbed, and forced into prostitution. And you said that about 10% of the total Indian population is involved. Girls and women are not considered by men in India, and therefore have no value for them other than sexual gratification. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but the whole thing is also a huge disaster. In China, too, girls and women have no value for men, which is why, as in India, many newborn girls are simply murdered because they want boys and not girls. However, because as a result of this fact, more boys are born than girls, there is actually a surplus of men in China, which means that this surplus mass does not find any women, which in turn leads to families robbing little girls mainly between the ages of about 8 years and letting them grow up with them in order to later marry them to their son. Traffickers also do the same and sell the stolen girls to families who then raise them to have a wife for their son later. Human theft and human trafficking exists in China, but also in India in the way that the stolen children are sold as work slaves, but also to rich, childless foreigners, as the despicable and criminal Mother Teresa did. But back to China, where women are very often forced by their husbands to have abortions when they are carrying a girl in their wombs. This is precisely when an ultrasound test shows that it is a girl. As I once heard, such ultrasound tests can only be carried out with bribes, because they are supposed to be prohibited in this respect. What I am interested in now is this. How many men can you count in China who cannot marry a woman? According to your knowledge, is there a certain number or percentage to be mentioned? I am also interested in the number of girls who are robbed every year by other families or by traffickers for the purpose of marrying the son of a family. You once said that you are constantly investigating these matters, which is why I am asking you about them now.
I can answer the questions because I have already retrieved the answers. The number of men without wives in China, because the number of women is too small, varies constantly between 55 and 60 million. And the annual number of girls who are robbed is, according to our investigations, about 140,000.
Actually, it would be time to officially mention what you just pointed out. Namely that you retrieved the answers to many of my questions, etc. with your little device, just as your daughter Simyase and Quetzal also did whenever it was necessary to answer my questions.
Actually, we have never talked openly about this, because there was never any reason to do so. But it is indeed the case that I, as well as my daughter and Quetzal, cannot always reproduce all the data, etc. only from our memory, which is why we always call up the corresponding data when it is necessary to be able to answer your questions.
But still you have a fabulous memory. But it is perhaps good that the readers of the contact reports now know that many of my questions have always been answered in the way that you retrieved them with your little device. But I would also like to know how it all works.
With this little device, I transmit your questions to my archive in my flying apparatus, where your words are automatically converted into the language of the archive at the moment of speaking. evaluated, and at the same time the corresponding answer data is picked out and transmitted to me again, directly into my consciousness. But now I still have things to discuss with you, which is why I came here today, so if you have no more questions.
As a matter of fact, I do not.
Then let me start with this.